This is a wonderful opportunity to be here, and I'd like to thank everybody who made it possible once again. I think my talk actually takes off from where the questions ended in the morning session. Working with the Makino collection actually brought me to working with that very different other kind of archive that we were talking about, the film archive. So 4 years ago, I started working intensively in the film archive, and so my presentation here is basically about working up to that point from the Makino collection to what I'm doing now. Destination Japan is the working title of my current research, an investigation of Japan as a foreign destination in visual and material culture of the first half of the 20th century. I chose to talk about my experience with the Makino collection and to think about its connection to Destination Japan for 3 reasons. First, Mr. Makino's approach toward building and using his collection modeled the process of forming a working collection of primary sources, including common use, otherwise expendable objects. Second, my current work raises questions and possible lines of investigation that suggest how the Makino collection might be used to better understand silent film history. Mr. Makino was interested in almost everything but film prints, and many of the films relevant to materials in the collection are lost. However, Mr. Makino had a special interest in nonfiction films, and there are good reasons why these films and silent amateur films shot on formats smaller than 35 millimeter might turn up on an archive shelf or surface some other way. Third, when I discussed Destination Japan with Mr. Makino a few years ago when the collection was still in his possession, I benefited from one of his famous dig, then discuss again, dig sessions, so I know that what I'm working on will bring me back to the collection. All the different presentations today reflect the Makino collection's significance as a multidisciplinary resource. I'll focus on its potential for silent film research and film preservation, and start with background that provides useful context. If film studies began as the neglected child of the academic curriculum, film itself spent its early life as an orphan. Abandoned by the production companies that made them, moving pictures were not systematically collected and maintained on an institutional basis until after silent cinema ended. University film courses and a body of film scholarship followed. This scholarship depended on the work of film archives, but academics and archivists were separated by a curiously artificial professional divide. This capsule outline describes the situation in the United States and Europe, but it was different in Japan. The National Film Center in Tokyo wasn't established until the 1950s, and the legitimization of academic film studies in Japan today is still a work in progress. I should add that even in the United States, the discipline is still often commonly volleyed back and forth between the predominantly European and American-centric departments of English and art history. This hasn't served the interests of Asian film studies very well. In Europe and the United States, the 1978 International Federation of Film Archives, or FIAF, Brighton Conference was instrumental in bringing archivists and film scholars together. Watching early films side by side, they launched a provocative revision of early film history. Especially after the moving picture centenary in the 1990s, the study, preservation, and archiving of silent cinema's remains grew exponentially, bringing opportunities for archival research and an increase in the number of silent film theatrical screenings. New discoveries and restoration projects followed, and it's now common for such projects to develop as collaborations between 2 or more archives. Again, this summary only describes the trajectory of silent film research in Europe, always ahead of the curve with government funding for cultural heritage, and the United States, where the National Film Preservation Foundation has provided funding opportunities for preservation projects since 1996. A comparable level of preservation, archiving, and increased scholarship became possible in Asia only during the last decade. The National Film Archive in Tokyo joined the International Federation of Film Archives in 1995 and now subscribes in principle to general FIAF policy. The 2002 FIAF annual conference was held at the Korean Film Archive, and it was the organization's first annual meeting in Asia, a turning point for Asian film preservation and film studies. Currently, the head of the Tokyo National Film Center is FIAF's president. A silent film studies explosion made feasible by increased preservation and access is at this very moment becoming a reality for those of us studying Japan's early cinema. Annual programming for the Pordenone Silent Film Festival, the largest exclusively silent film festival since it began in 1982, confirms an increased interest in early Asian cinema. In the 1990s, Pordenone featured the first curator programs of films from India and China. In the 1990s, Japanese film has been featured 5 different years to date, beginning in 2001. This year's festival, held last month, included 2 substantial programs of silent animated shorts made in Japan. After the last screening, National Film Center representatives announced their commitment to ensuring Japanese films are included in the festival yearly from now on. The survival rate for Japanese feature film is depressing. These are the figures that they gave at last year's Pordenone conference. But there are still other films that they can show for screening. These films they can always recommend in the future. These films are now a primary focus of early film research because they educate us beyond the canon and our received knowledge of film history. I'll put the Makino collection's role in advancing Japanese silent cinema studies and archival practice into sharper perspective by saying a little about my own Makino experience. My first encounter with the name Makino Mamoru was at the Shinjuku branch of Kinokuniya in the film book section. This was probably sometime around 1986 or 7 because what I saw was an announcement for the newly published Eiga Kenetsu Jiho reprint series, an early example of Mr. Makino's many efforts to provide increased access to foundational primary material. I took something for future reference. I think it was an advertisement. I fervently hope it was not another book's paper obi. If it was an obi, I might be forgiven because in those days, even secondary sources on pre-1950s Japanese cinema were scarce. I remember how astonished I was to see this material, reprints of censorship records from 1925 to 1943, actually available for purchase. I'd arrived in Japan in the mid-1980s to do field work for a doctoral dissertation on the screenwriter Yoda Yoshikata. I knew relatively little about silent cinema in Japan. I had faithfully attended all of the screenings of the 1981 Mizoguchi retrospective at the Japan Society in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Several years earlier, as a college student, I'd studied with Yoda and other Kyoto film cohorts at Osaka University of Arts, and they provided me another window on how much I was missing. Noel Birch's 1979 study of Japanese cinema, To the Distant Observer, also stoked interest in early cinema for everyone who read it at the time. In 1987, I began teaching at Ibaraki University, and after that I commuted to Yoda's home in Kyoto every few months. As Yoda and I talked, he would often stop mid-sentence, run upstairs, and grab a copy of an old screenplay or a journal from one of the amateur film clubs he belonged to in his youth. At the time of our meetings, he was writing about the man he considered his first mentor, the film director Murata Minoru, and that's how I became interested in the pure film movement. I didn't realize it then, but Yoda's discuss again approach to our working together was my pre-Makino period of training. I finally met Mr. Makino on a tour of the National Film Center's film vaults in Sangamihara, sometime after my Kinokuniya encounter. I recognized his name and was excited to meet him. We talked, he asked me about my studies. I said I was working on a doctoral dissertation about screenwriting in Japan from the industry's origins to sometime significantly later. I remember this well because he widened his eyes immediately and suggested I might want to reconsider that later date. He seemed more interested when I mentioned focusing on lost films, titles commonly encountered in secondary sources, but now the stuff of legend because they are not known to survive. He asked if I had thought about what would happen if any of these films actually showed up after I'd finished writing. This time I stared with wide open eyes because I hadn't thought of that at all as a liability. This conversation marked a turning point in determining the direction of my thesis. I knew I couldn't tiptoe around a film only because it was no longer available for formal analysis, and the textual sources I was using were valuable links to those lost images. But my objective was not limited to a recuperation of visual narratives alone. On the train back to Ibaraki that night, I decided Mr. Makino had a real knack for putting bees in other people's bonnets. Yoda Yoshikata became ill with pancreatic cancer in 1990 and died 1 year later. Mr. Makino immediately took me under his wing. As he did for so many others, he invited me to his home, generously sharing his collection, his enthusiasm, and his knowledge. Each time I visited, he was always prepared with several stacks of material that he knew I would find useful, and he never showed me anything without priceless commentary and endless layers of background information. I was familiar with the usual research collections, but had found no other accessible source for the material in which I was interested. At the time, this was anything related to writing for the screen, which included draft scenarios, screenplays, shooting scripts, benchy scripts, continuities, and countless variants of motion picture novelizations, which Mr. Makino had even for other countries beside Japan. I received Mr. Makino's new book last week, the book that's on the table outside, just in time to remind me of details of a time I recall only as a frantic blur. Mr. Makino always kept a much better record of my Makino activity. Characteristically thorough, he's written that for 1 year I made weekly trips from Ibaraki Prefecture to Kokubunji in order to scavenge his archive, making, quote, a maximum of 800 and a minimum of 400 copies at a time at a local convenience store. This material and Makino's steady flow of reprint publications were vital sources as I reworked my dissertation into a book, Writing in Light. To me, the contrast between Writing in Light and my dissertation, partially based on research I had completed before using the Makino collection, is striking. For example, nearly all of the illustrations in the book are from the Makino reprint series. In the case of periodicals, organizing these projects entailed locating other sources, often other private collections, to provide the issues that were needed to complete each volume. Writing in Light refers to films and even entire genres that can no longer be seen. I would have had very little, if anything, to represent such work without the frame captures and advertisements in those reprints. In the process of preparing these illustrations, I gained a perspective on my subject that I had not anticipated, and it rekindled my interest in working with the visual image. This was in the days before digital scanning, and as I looked through the camera lens to put images in focus, I found myself riveted to the compositional and tonal beauty that was apparent even in the reproductions of these skillfully shot frames. There's a sentence in the introduction to Writing in Light that I would not write today. In an attempt to give the reader a sense of the constraints of silent film research, I wrote, a large part of the challenge in understanding the nature of the silent Japanese film industry lies in learning how to work within the boundaries of what is feasible. Reading this today, I realized the extent to which Mr. Makino and his collection have been so important to my education. I've learned to focus instead on overcoming these constraints in order to redraw those boundaries. I've learned much more from working with Mr. Makino and his collection, but I'll conclude with a few examples of the material I'm now using to find the destination Japan that only these objects can provide. I also have a film excerpt shot in Japan by an American tourist, Charles Wyeth, sometime between 1928 and 1932, that is part of the George Eastman collection. Wyeth's world tour of Japan in cherry blossom time is a record of a tour of Imperial Japan, a period well represented in the Makino collection. Finding it was part of a fortuitous twist in the course of my work. I began this project as a deliberate attempt at non-film focused research because I was sick of working with non-existent films. The project unexpectedly circled back to film, only this time they're real. Identifying, contextualizing, and appreciating these surviving films is one way in which the collection will be useful. Our perspective on film history is biased by what we can see, but personal accounts like this travel film show us something easily overshadowed by other visual records. They embody the subjective experience of the everyday. My first sensation of what Japan must have looked like to foreign tourists in the 1920s and 30s came while watching a 1920s Japanese feature film in Pordenone in 2001. I thought I recognized the shot location from a recently purchased picture postcard of Kobe. Starting to collect postcards was one result of having been immersed for so long in a period of filmmaking with no surviving images. At first, I just enjoyed their beauty, which reminded me of early methods of hand-coloring silent film. And then I discovered the sensation of re-experiencing them as objects of human communication. Instead of all too familiar disparagement, John Uri sees tourism as flexible and inclusive, as well as constructive in linking the flow of 20th century material culture and cultural identity. I've borrowed his perspective. Because of the close historical affinity of tourism and education and their similarity as processes of subjective identity formation, I also widened my parameters to interpret tourism as temporarily limited travel, both actual, physical, experiential, and virtual, educational, informational. The wide variety of promotional, educational, and entertainment material that I've collected or located in other collections represent a snapshot rather than any sort of complete canon. That's why I'm building an interactive online component that will allow me to solicit contributions and commentary from other participants. An NEH Summer Institute in 2002 was influential in giving shape to the project, and I've been teaching a course to complement this research on an average of every 2 years since then, and I'm just showing a few of the images. This is one of my favorite, of course, because of the personal inscription on the postcard. But just to give you an idea of the variety of the material, material that gives a view of Japan as a member of the movement of internationalization, Japan at expositions, Japan, actually I didn't know till I found this postcard where you see it's postmarked Rochester, I forget the date actually, 1911, but it's, apparently there was some exhibit of Japan at the Ontario Beach Park in Rochester, so I'm learning things that have happened locally from collecting this material. Japan conjured up as an amusement park. The very well-known Japan Gardens in Wonderland Revere Beach in Massachusetts. Images and objects not of Japanese origin, trade, collecting cards, sheet music. I should say that the intersection between promoting business and tourism is really proving to be very fascinating. Common subjective categories of foreign origin, tourist brochures, the shipping lines that were so active in the interwar period, published an enormous amount of material, stereo views, and just some of the many magazines that are available to see. My attention was abruptly brought back to working with moving images when I bought a film can on eBay for $20 that turned out not to be empty. Reel 2 of Nippon no Josei, a film by the Board of Tourist Industry, taught me that photochemical film is actually not entirely mechanically reproducible. It is organic, a transmutable, tangible object that carries evidence of its own past production and use. The film was in an advanced stage of decomposition, and my colleagues at George Eastman House wrote up an estimate of what it would cost to preserve the single reel. The National Film Center couldn't confirm whether or not they had a unique copy, and I eventually failed to save it. But holding it in my hands was enough to make me realize I needed to learn more about the physical nature of film, film as an object, a new direction for my research. And in a fortuitous turn of events, I just realized that Professor Ikegawa has actually seen a copy of this film at the British War Museum. And we were very excited to share this piece of information. So I'm just going to now, scroll through a few images from some of the other films that I found. This is a tourist promotional film from 1916. This is on 35 millimeter. It's nitrate. I took the photograph from the nitrate print, but it has been transferred to safety film and restored. This is an amateur film that was shot in Japan, I believe in the late 20s. Actually, it might have been in the early 30s because the film stock, there were two different kinds of film stock in the film. And what's interesting about it was the person who shot the film was a member of the Amateur Cinema League. And their interest in film culture in Japan is fascinating. First of all, besides these kinds of everyday scenes, they also, I believe it's a she, ran into a film in production in the countryside while she was traveling around. And so there's some shots that she took of the various people who were acting in the film at Jidaigeki. I don't know where, but she has a little title card that explains how they ran into this and how fortunate she felt. And then she has pictures, footage of the box office in Asakusa, which for me was extremely exciting. I'd seen photographs of it, but I'd never really seen it in action, and other photographs of Asakusa as well. So my PowerPoint presentation stops here, and I'm going to conclude with this 8-minute film by Charles Wyeth. It was one of 3 reels that were in a bad state of decomposition. They were preserved, so they are available for access. It was a tourist named Charles Wyeth. It was deposited at the George Eastman House in 1989, and the records weren't very clear, but presumably by a relative. It's already been preserved. It's one of 3 reels. In terms of where it was shot, I think you could recognize a few of the locations, but what's most curious to me is that, I've seen a few of these now, and everybody seems to pick on, all of the people who take these films pick on some different motif, always with more time spent filming people than the places themselves, which I find very interesting. I don't know if you noticed, but Mr. Wyeth had a real interest in people who are carrying things. He was really fascinated. The amateur film that I showed you earlier, it was feet. There was just scene after scene every once in a while. There would be like a whole montage of different kinds of footwear. So sometimes they follow a narrative pattern. They very often will start with a map of Japan that will show the route. There's often some shots that are taken on the boat. And then they go through the various towns. You can sort of trace the itineraries from the kinds of itineraries that were being advertised at the time in the Japanese publication Tourist, which was published bilingually, and they would tell you whether it was a 9-day tour, a 10-day tour, a two-week tour. Let's see, what else? I think you can recognize the Imperial Hotel, which was interesting, and of course there's the colonization dimension, which for me, I thought that I had studied Asia pretty well. And when I saw these images, I really felt that I was having a sensation about a period of Japan's history that I had not gotten from books. And I think that's one of the ways that these amateur films can be so incredibly informative and exciting. You did notice, I think, a couple of shots of Mount Fuji in the clouds. He did finally get it without the clouds. So I just thought I would put that in there. So thank you very much.